after JonBenet was killed. Burke's interviewed 2 weeks later by someone from the Department of Social Services at the behest of the family. They put the condition on it that it cannot be a Boulder police officer or detective.
No, because I'm trying to stay away from the press. My friend said that after school, there's all these media people waiting there going, hello, did you see Burke in class today? No, I did not. I think he was absent. Oh, thanks.
You want to find out who killed my sister?
It's pretty clear that Burke is sort of acting like a smart aleck here. Like, I'm smart and I'm proud of myself. You know, he lays back.
You know, parents are sometimes crying. Yeah. But I'm basically just going on with my life. You know?
A few major things point to Patsy Ramsey not having been to bed the night JonBenet died. Number one, Detective Steve Thomas, after comparing a photo of Patsy Ramsey at the White's Christmas party earlier that night versus what Officer Rick French reported she had been wearing when he arrived at the house, he felt like it was evident she likely had not been to bed, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I said the same thing after I read Officer Rick French's report and saw that he said her makeup was perfectly intact. Those are the sort of details that make your heart race. It's just highly unlikely, in my opinion, that a wealthy beauty queen like Patsy, with a closet full of designer clothes at her disposal, would choose to put back on clothes that she had worn to a dinner party the night before, where she had been hugging people and eating and drinking, especially not for a flight on a private jet to her summer house the next morning. Patsy is the sort of woman who likely had an outfit for everything because she was very wealthy. So she probably had a designated wardrobe for traveling. So it's far more likely that she simply never went to bed, never removed her makeup, and never removed her clothes because something and someone in that house caused JonBenet's death shortly after they returned home from that party. Patsy was likely up all night, staging the crime scene, rehearsing her 911 call, and writing that letter. But again, that's just my opinion. There was something about this particular theory that really distressed me and made the hairs raise on the back of my neck, and even at one point brought tears to my eyes, because certain elements of this theory about Patsy being up all night makes it quite easy to envision just what Patsy may or may not have been doing while she was awake. And it is so vivid, it makes my stomach turn. It is so eerie how clear the evidence seems to be regarding Patsy Ramsey's possible involvement with what happened to JonBenet that night or with covering it up. Furthermore, there was a major inconsistency in the sequence of Patsy's account of events, particularly the order in which she found JonBenet missing from her bed versus when she found the letter. At one point, she reportedly said she found the letter first and ran directly to her. At another point, she reportedly said she noticed JonBenet wasn't in bed and then looked to find her and found the letter. I mean, which is it? How can you possibly not remember? How could the moment you realize your daughter was taken not be burned into your memory in vivid detail for eternity, especially later that same day when she gave her first statement to the police? And again, that statement of that moment changed dramatically when she was later interviewed by the police. And that's not a small inconsistency. Discrepancies in a detail this critical that someone ought to be able to recall with ease in the days and weeks following that event suggests to me that she is not being honest about the events of that night and that morning, and that she may be fabricating a narrative that is not actually stored in her authentic memory, hence why her stories keep shifting according to what she felt or was advised sounded more believable at the time, in my opinion. The other gargantuan inconsistency in Patsy's story was that she had changed JonBenet into a red turtleneck before bed, meaning she changed her out of the white crewneck shirt she had worn to the White's party, which makes sense to me that a mom like Patsy Patsy, a beauty pageant mom, wouldn't let JonBenét go to bed in her nice sequenced shirt so that it wouldn't get ruined. It makes sense to me that she would change her into something more comfortable, like the red turtleneck. Problem was, JonBenét was found in the white crew neck with the sequenced star, and the red turtleneck, according to Detective Thomas, was later found rolled up on the bathroom sink. Patsy would later tell the police that JonBenét had gone to bed in the white crew neck. And mind you, a huge part of the failure of this investigation is that the DA's office kept handing over all major evidence to the defense team, far more than they were legally obligated to, long before the parents were ever formally interviewed in 1997. So they had the opportunity to adjust their stories according to the evidence the police had, on top of having the benefit of their lawyers obstructing certain questions and controlling the setting where the interview took place and whether or not the interview could even be recorded, and even having the DA, Hofstrom, suggesting a freaking break when Detective Steve Thomas got Patsy vulnerable and emotional and possibly could have gotten her to break, or at the very least admit to her involvement in covering up JonBenét's death. The DA's office, the district attorney's office, and seemingly all the forces in the universe had conspired to bungle this investigation, which is why it remains unsolved. And chillingly, as I remember, there were different times where Patsy seemed on the verge of coming clean, like when she was highly emotional during that interview before the DA suggested they take a break. Also, when she was highly emotional while giving blood and DNA samples, and she blurted, "I didn't kill my baby." She said it multiple times to Detective Steve Thomas and whoever else was present, to the point where her lawyer got fidgety and felt he needed to step in. Also, there was reportedly one point in the CNN interview where Patsy, possibly still high on sedatives, had articulated a list of reasons why JonBenét was better off dead, which is just unconscionable. This was according to Detective Steve Thomas, and I wish he had have listed the reasons she gave for why JonBenét was better off dead, because there doesn't seem to be a complete video or complete transcript available anywhere on the internet of that initial CNN interview they gave days after JonBenét's funeral in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is when they seemed to be evading being formally interviewed by police. In that same interview with CNN, Patsy would then look directly into the camera and warn the citizens of Boulder to keep their babies close. However, the mayor of Boulder would later come out and directly contradict Patsy's claims that there was a killer on the loose and that the town should be worried. The mayor undoubtedly said this to control the panic breaking out amongst her citizens, but also probably to imply they were looking into the Ramseys as possible suspects, and that's something the Ramseys did not want to convey to the public, but that the mayor basically implied that there didn't have to necessarily be an intruder that committed this crime, and that you can't just take the prime suspect's word at face value. But the major issue with the discrepancies in the part of Patsy's story where she discusses what JonBenét wore to bed is that it further indicates JonBenét had gotten up after her parents had put her to bed. And I do believe at some point she may have been wearing that red turtleneck, just like Patsy had originally said. And then she was likely later changed into the white crew neck, which may have been readily available after she wore it to the party, and this possibly took place sometime after the crime occurred, when evidence may have been being destroyed by whoever possibly staged the crime scene. Remember, JonBenét was also found wrapped in a blanket, so there were some maternal aspects as to what went on with her body after the crime occurred. And these extreme polarities in the event of what took place with JonBenét, meaning the brutality of her killing versus the tender aspects of the staging and her hands being tied loosely and her being wrapped in a blanket and put in the basement instead of left outside in the dark and cold, these could indicate that different motives were at play and that multiple people had dealt with her. And with the evidence of her long johns and her underwear being soaked in urine, it continues to beg the question, did she wet her bed? Which I saw was inconclusive. Nobody could say definitively that she did wet the bed. And if she did wet her bed, this was probably what prompted her to get out of bed that night, ultimately to her doom. Or Was she awakened and tortured someplace else in that house and then voided her bladder during her torture, and then someone changed her underwear and wiped her down, which is what some forensic evidence may have suggested, that she was wiped down and changed. John Ramsey told his daughters, Melinda Ramsey's longtime boyfriend, Stuart Long, that he had found JonBenét's body around 11 o'clock, which would have been 2 hours before he discovered the body with Fleet White around 1 p.m. This supports my theory that John may not have known what happened initially and possibly walked in on a botched cover-up that Patsy was trying to orchestrate. There's a strong possibility that John knew nothing and went along with what Patsy said had happened, that is, until he stumbled upon the truth for himself, while tons of friends and police officers were present, and I believe he kept quiet about what he knew at that point. I honestly believe that around 11 o'clock, that he may have found JonBenet somewhere in the house and then transported her to that room and even wrapped her in a blanket. That may have been his doing, and I'll explain why a little later. It's also worth noting that when JonBenet was found around 1 p.m., she had a blanket tucked around her. So according to Steve Thomas's book, the Mindhunter author and former FBI agent John Douglas stated that in paternal murders, great care is usually shown in the disposal of the body. JonBenet had been carefully tucked into a blanket and not discarded outside in the freezing cold, if they were trying to make it look like the people who kidnapped her later killed her and dumped her. I find this concept deeply unnerving but plausible. And if it was the case that John first found her sometime around 11 a.m., it's not implausible to believe he was the one to wrap her in the blanket while she was in the basement, and while they were essentially waiting for her body to be discovered by law enforcement. This theory can be corroborated by the very fact that it was John Ramsey who would throw a blanket over her body after he carried her upstairs and when she was lying on the floor after being found. He tossed a blanket over her, further contaminating the crime scene, but I understand why he would have had the instinct to protect her dignity in that state. It's also a horrifying image for everyone, and I can imagine he wanted to protect Patsy from seeing their daughter with the life drained from her tiny body, which by then was in full rigor mortis, which is something that's very difficult to look at. So I don't think he had anything nefarious in mind when he covered her body, and I don't believe he intentionally was trying to contaminate the evidence. I believe he was just acting on a deep, abiding, protective, paternal instinct. But of course, there is always the possibility that he was being calculating and actively trying to destroy evidence.
All I'm saying is that I did not feed her pineapple when we returned home from the White's house. She was sound asleep. She was put in her bed and tucked in good night.
And we don't know if that's significant or not. All we know is what we've told the police, and that is that neither Patsy or I gave JonBenet pineapple when we got home that night.
Can you describe that to me?
My oh my, whoever thought a simple bowl of fruit could cause such a stir in a child homicide case full of so many other diabolical factors? Well, it did, and rightfully so. A bowl of pineapple and milk was found on the table in the kitchen of the Ramsey home by investigators alongside a cup of tea. Both the bowl and the teacup contained the fingerprints of Burke Ramsey, and the bowl of pineapple contained the fingerprints of Patsy Ramsey, although she continued to insist she did not prepare that late night snack for Burke, which leads many to believe Burke may have prepared it for himself that night. Patsy said she wouldn't have used such a long spoon for such a small bowl, and that kind of tracks with the type of woman she is. And the fact that Patsy's fingerprints were on the bowl, they could have been meaning it could have been from her touching the bowl previously, like during washing or drying or storing the dish away. However, the pineapple is a far greater deal in this case than it would have been in probably any other case for multiple reasons. One, it proves at the very least that Burke was up that night after his parents believed he had gone to bed, because the bowl did not show signs it had been rotting on the counter for days prior to the night of December 25th, and Patsy surely would not have allowed that. They also had a housekeeper. And the pineapple is also highly significant because JonBenét was found to have undigested tropical fruit in her body, which meant it must have been consumed after the crab she ate at the Whites' Christmas party earlier that night, since that crab had already been digested. This places both Burke and JonBenét awake that evening, likely after their parents believed both of them to have been in bed. And it raises many questions about what took place when the children were up and alone together, eating pineapple. Did something occur between them that could have possibly led to JonBenét's death? At the very least, the bowl of pineapple containing Burke's fingerprints strongly refutes the narrative that he had gone to bed like a good little boy and did not wake up until long after JonBenét's so-called kidnapping had taken place. It also serves to indicate that no member of that family can truly be seen as innocent in that home, because they all participated in misleading the police and the public about the true sequence of events that night, especially with regard to that freaking pineapple. No one would give a straight, consistent, or logical answer about why it was there and why it contained Burke and Patsy's fingerprints, and why pineapple was found undigested in JonBenét's intestines. Later, during a police interview, Burke would be questioned directly about the bowl of pineapple that he was suspected to have been eating with JonBenét, and he is even shown a photo of it, and his response is so puzzling, to say the least. It's clear he is not being very forthcoming about what he knows about that pineapple. As even Detective Lou Smit, the biggest proponent of the intruder theory, would say, the pineapple was a big bugaboo for those who believed a stranger broke into the Ramsey home on Christmas night and committed this crime. And he is exactly right. That, along with the evidence that suggested Patsy may not have gone to bed the night JonBenét died. The reason the ransom note is so long is that the person writing it was not truly seeking a ransom. They had not kidnapped anybody. Their mindset while writing it, in my opinion, was selling a narrative. And they were so hell-bent on making their narrative sound believable, they got carried away focusing on unnecessary nuances and protracted threats that experts say were quoted from movies. And they were so focused on that the length of the letter became such that it was totally counterproductive to the narrative they were selling. Not only does the 2.5-page length of the letter expose that this was a fake and staged kidnapping, but so does the content within the letter, the things they were saying and how they were saying it. It just intuitively sounded phony. I lean heavily towards Patsy Ramsey writing the ransom letter, in my opinion. Not only because handwriting analysts could never definitively rule her out, and in fact some indicated she could have been the writer, I believe any slight variations in her script could have easily been contrived by her, since she was in the mindset of covering a crime. So she, in my opinion, would have at least had the wherewithal to use her non-dominant hand to disguise her writing, which I believe was her left hand. And this would account for why her script was so similar to the ransom letter handwriting, and would at the same time easily account for any inconsistencies, in my opinion. She also could have been making a conscious effort while writing to mask any writing idiosyncrasies, which there's evidence of later that Steve Thomas found. But a great tell that the letter was written by Patsy, in my estimation, is the fact that she was a journalism major. She reportedly graduated from West Virginia University with a bachelor's in journalism, and also had a career in technical writing and in writing manuals, and she also worked as the head of marketing for a couple of companies. That means Patsy was familiar with narrative crafting drafting and storytelling, even PR. She was familiar with how to compose text to elicit various things in readers, which can be substantiated by her background in journalism and marketing. And she was very familiar with composition of the English language in general. There are times throughout the Ransom letter where the writer seems to have an odd flair for dramatic prose, which is certainly suspicious and could easily be attributed to Patsy's extensive background in writing. She reportedly made a studied effort to alter her handwriting in the copies she wrote for the investigators after December 25th, as compared to earlier samples of her writing that they got from her that were written before the killing. Granted, it was already clear to many that she was the author of the Ransom Note, even just logically speaking, based on her being the one to discover it, conveniently laid on the stairs that she happened to come down in the morning, which were in the back of the house, and based on it being written in her notepad versus John's, and based on it only containing her fingerprints, and the pen used for the ransom note being placed neatly back in its proper spot near the phone also suggests a maternal instinct. The matronly "listen closely" and "be well rested" and the lack of cursing also helped to implicate Patsy. And also, the author exhibiting a laughable ineptitude where criminality is concerned also pointed at Patsy. The author exhibiting ignorance of how typical ransom notes are composed, and the author exhibiting an extensive vocabulary and an elevated writing style, like, oh, you know, someone with a journalism degree, also indicated Patsy, because they use words like attaché, which is a French word, kind of like she made JonBenet's name French, and they also used the word hence, and they also said, "We have your daughter in our possession," instead of "we took your daughter" or "we have your daughter." So the letter was overlong, cartoonishly evil, and sounded like a person trying to do their best impersonation of what they think a real kidnapper might sound like. Yet in doing so, the writer inadvertently revealed they were not some criminal mastermind, but a hoaxer, someone staging a crime to make it appear as though it was committed by professionals. All of this was clear from the get-go. However, what drove the nail in the coffin for Patsy, no pun intended, was the way she conscientiously altered her style of writing after the killing. To me, this showed she had something to hide, and we can all guess precisely what that was. In Steve Thomas's words, in the 376-word ransom note, the small letter A was printed in manuscript style 109 times and written in cursive lowercase style only 5 times. The entry on Fernie, the name Barbara Fernie, contained just a small printed manuscript A as the second letter of the word Barbara, but it had been boldly written over with a black felt tip pen and made into the cursive style A. We had noticed earlier that in pre-homicide writings, Patsy consistently used the manuscript A, but post-homicide, it disappeared from her samples of writing. This was a major find, for it looked as if she was consciously changing her lettering. She had more handwriting styles than a class of 6th graders and was seemingly able to change as easily as turning on and off different computer fonts. Every single detail that surfaces about this case seems to point to Patsy Ramsey as the one responsible for everything that went down that night and in the wee hours of December 26, 1996. Even the fiber evidence, it had Patsy written all over it, and I cannot express to you how mind-blowing that is. It truly sends a chill down my spine, and is the reason I cannot confidently lock into my own theory about this case and state it with any true conviction, because this Patsy stuff leaves me mystified, even after all the research. Here is what Steve Thomas said in his book as they narrowed in on Patsy Ramsey as the prime suspect. If there was one certainty in this entire investigation, it was the nearly unanimous consensus with the law enforcement community that probable cause existed to arrest Patsy Ramsey. I believe that, as did every other detective on the investigating squad and our boss, Sergeant Tom Wickman, who one day suggested the probable cause is there. Maybe the 5 of us should just go make the arrest. Commander John Eller believed it, as did Police Chief Tom Colby and his successor, Mark Beckner, who personally told me so. Chief Colby would also tell me later that District Attorney Alex Hunter thought from day one that Patsy did it and that probable cause existed. That is just so freaking spooky. It gives me literal goosebumps how close they were, and that when you consider that God or the universe or whatever forces you believe in may have conspired to give this child justice after all, in spite of all the sabotaging efforts of her parents and their lawyers and the DA's office, when her speculated killer died an untimely death 10 years later from a terminal illness. Let's be clear, it was touch DNA, which means it could have been transferred from literally anywhere and even planted. And the sample was so small as to be barely suitable for testing. And there is simply nothing that ties the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing to the actual crime, unlike if the DNA had been sourced from blood or semen, or found on the literal murder weapon. That would be a different story. Touch DNA on her clothing could have been transferred from a previous time she wore her clothes, or even a time that she mixed her clothes together, especially if JonBenet slept in the shirt that she wore to the party, or if it was put on after she was killed when her clothes were being rearranged. The DNA evidence is too unreliable if it boils down to it simply being cells, particularly in a crime scene that was this contaminated when the body was wiped down, staged, and moved multiple times. Essentially, it could have come from anywhere. It's just not of the same forensic value, and is not even as incriminating as blood or semen would have been, which would have indicated direct involvement with her death. But because it's merely touch DNA, it's highly likely it could have been transferred from an innocuous source. The DNA could have even belonged to someone who helped stage the crime scene and who may have handled JonBenet that we simply don't know of, since the Ramseys had so many connections and had a team of supporters and acquaintances at their beck and call, especially at their home the second they called the police. They called over a whole troop of people. So they very well could have called someone over before they called the police. So ultimately, the DNA is of little forensic value, according to experts who evaluated the crime, despite the proponents of the intruder theory and John Ramsey clinging to this DNA as though it's the smoking gun in this case. It's really not. The DNA is essentially inconclusive at best and irrelevant at worst. One of the more hair-raising things about this case involves a purchase made before the night of the killing. According to investigator Steve Thomas, in early December, bank records indicated that one of the Ramseys had visited a local hardware store called McGuckin's, and they purchased items that were not itemized on the receipt. When the receipt matching their bank records was later retrieved by the office manager of the store, it would soon be revealed that it bore the signature of Patsy Ramsey. He then reached out to police because he thought it was all very strange. What the detectives were ultimately interested in is whether or not Patsy had purchased any supplies that could have indicated she was premeditating the murder of her daughter, or if perhaps she had simply purchased any of the items that were then subsequently used in JonBenét's death, or even the crime scene in general. However, because the items she purchased were not specified by name on the receipt, and because the store had already recorded over the surveillance footage from that particular day by the time the investigators were made aware of the Ramseys' banking records, which, by the way, is a standard fact-finding warrant for persons of interest, yet this was another process denied by the DA's office to the detriment of this entire case. But anyway, as a result of the poor timing, the information discovered from the receipts wasn't very helpful because there was no longer the surveillance footage available to go along with the receipts and corroborate whatever they believed that she purchased. Had the DA's office signed off on the warrants for their credit card receipts sooner, they may have discovered these purchases sooner when the surveillance footage was still available. One of the receipts showed the price and store location where one of the items they were interested in was shelved. This at least helped the detectives narrow down the location of the purchased items to the sporting goods section. And lo and behold, that department of the store happened to contain a brand of soft nylon rope very similar to the one used to fashion the so-called Garotte that killed JonBenét. After the evidence and samples from the store were examined, it was determined it could have very well been the rope used. This is just highly unnerving. Perhaps even more telling is that the price of the nylon rope in this location of the sporting goods department, which was $2.29, also happened to match the price of the item from that same store listed on Patsy's receipt for $2.29. Naturally, it's believed that Patsy could have knowingly or unknowingly purchased the rope eventually used in the murder weapon that day, although this remains unconfirmed since her receipt doesn't list the name of the exact item purchased. It was also discovered, however, that the tape used to cover JonBenét's mouth matched the price and location of another item found on that same receipt, and was a very close match to the tape used on the paintings hung throughout the Ramsey home. Stranger still is that the detectives only discovered these items purchased at this hardware store because someone had been impersonating John Ramsey and calling the store to look into charges on his credit card bill. In my opinion, it was likely one of John's lawyers or PIs trying to get ahead of the narrative and ensuring that nothing incriminating could be gleaned from those purchases. But in doing so, they startled the store manager so much that he later alerted the police, knowing that the daughter of John Ramsey had recently been killed. The Ramseys were undeniably suspicious. From booking flights out of town when the body of their daughter was found, to hiring a fleet of lawyers and PIs to obstruct the police investigation from the second she was found, to forcing the police to give up her body while the forensic investigation was still ongoing and they could have extracted more details from her, to refusing formal police interviews until spring the following year when she had died in winter of 1996, and then even speaking to the media shortly after her funeral instead of the police, even all the way to them trying to control every aspect of the conditions of their interviews once they finally deigned to meet with the police, then to them not letting Burke be interviewed by police until 1998, long after he could have been coached on what to say, to not taking polygraphs offered by the FBI and choosing to sponsor their own, to the strange inconsistencies in their testimonies of that day, especially Patsy's. There was just a number of ways they stood out to police as highly suspicious, and this is the reason they were never ruled out as suspects in the beginning. As the saying goes, the guilty truly need no accusing, and the Ramseys' behavior implicated them far more than any theory the police could come up with. And to deflect suspicion from themselves, John and Patsy basically fingered everyone they knew, aside from their blood relatives, I noticed. Yet they are all up in arms and suing the socks off of anyone who dares to point a finger back at them. How is that fair? How is that even reasonable? These people had zero credibility or integrity from the start. And with even statistics saying the family is more likely responsible for a child's death in the home, and in consideration of the way they betrayed their close friends and neighbors by casting suspicion on them, I'm glad they've never known a moment's peace, and that the media and the public has kept their collective foot on their throat since that 911 call was made, because these are awful people who I believe know far more than they've ever been willing to let on. What's clear here about the Ramseys is that beyond having financial capital, which in essence equates to them having unlimited means, like freaking private planes and lawyers and publicists and PIs and prosecutors in their back pocket, they also clearly had a great deal of social capital, which easily translated into political capital in their community, and I think this was a huge reason the case remained unsolved. This financial capital and their extensive social network also enabled the Ramseys to protect themselves. They were seriously insulated from any scrutiny. And in addition to that, they were highly litigious and going after anyone of consequence who dared to publicly contradict their narrative, including detectives who had worked on the case and documentarians. In addition to that, their tight-knit social circles meant that almost any group the police approached in the Ramseys' orbit, they were fiercely stonewalled by them. From the church to the children's school, to John's workplace, to their closest friends and some neighbors, even to their extended families. down to John's ex-wife, who he admittedly cheated on. Even she was tight-lipped and lawyered up and would not implicate him in any way when she finally did speak to the police. That's strange, right? Was she being intimidated or paid? What incentive would this woman who had been cheated on have to protect her ex-husband to that degree? At the very least, you could be honest and discuss what an unfaithful piece of shit he was, because contrary to popular belief, that history is relevant. Suppose he was also cheating on Patsy, and an outraged Patsy hurt JonBenet to teach John a lesson, theoretically. Or suppose he had a psychotic mistress who hurt JonBenet to teach him a lesson. These things happen. That's why it's important for the police to leave no stone unturned. It's not up to John's family to determine what information is relevant to the investigation. And if John was a serial cheater, it could have had major implications on what happened to his daughter and who would have had motive to hurt her, especially because, in some regards, the ransom note indicated John was a target of their actions. This is a massive deal that cannot be overstated. Also, it is a massive deal that a detective, Steve Thomas, who was actively investigating this case, was so utterly off-put by the DA office's collusion with the Ramseys and their legal team that he resigned from the Boulder Police Department, publicly stating his disgust, and then reiterated his suspicions and findings in a book which I read, revealing that he believed Patsy Ramsey to be responsible for the death of her daughter. That is enormous, and at the very least, it is a scathing commentary on how corrupt the DA's office and different figures in the police department were in Boulder, Colorado at this time. It's just despicable, and they are directly responsible for the grotesque and preventable miscarriage of justice dealt to this innocent 6-year-old child, who is so deserving of having her killer brought to justice after all this time. A grand jury actually voted to indict Patsy and John in 1999, but this is something the public would not find out about for over a decade until a juror let it slip that they had voted to convict, following which the documents were finally unsealed. According to the Denver Post, a Boulder grand jury indictment in 1999 accused John and Patsy Ramsey of 2 counts each of child abuse resulting in death in connection to the first-degree murder of their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenet, according to documents released Friday morning. The charges didn't directly accuse the Ramseys of killing their daughter. Instead, they alleged that the parents permitted JonBenet to be placed in a dangerous situation that led to her death, and it accused them of helping whoever killed the girl. The Ramseys were never officially indicted, however, because former District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the documents and prosecute the Ramseys. The problem with the DA's office at the time is that they were totally spineless. They'd spent so much time plea bargaining every case that hit their desks that when the time came for the behemoth that was the JonBenet case to go to court, particularly with it looking more and more like her wealthy and well-connected parents may have been culpable, no one in the DA's office had the guts or prowess to try a case of this magnitude. They'd gone soft and were essentially out of shape due to lack of practice. Detective Thomas said the one thing they kept sticking to, no matter how much overwhelming evidence was presented to them, is that it wasn't enough to convict. The grand jury agreed at the very least that the parents were guilty of child abuse, and from the general sentiment online, most people can understand how one or both parents were responsible for the staging and possibly even the killing. Maybe they couldn't have proven first degree or second degree, because at this rate most police want you to have a videotape of the crime itself, but I still feel there was more than enough evidence to at least convict the Ramseys of something and hold them accountable in some regard. Not only that, but just think of the incriminating evidence and even a confession that could have been obtained by the investigators if they were not inhibited at every turn by the DA's short leash, not granting them the proper warrants and the leeway to ask the questions they wanted to ask to the particular people they needed the answers from. Worse still, is that in 2006, a district attorney eventually cleared the Ramseys, or tried to clear their names based on the DNA evidence, but this was later reversed by a succeeding district attorney who said her decision was improper. So Stan Garnett tells people that as the 20th anniversary of JonBenét's death approaches, he has not wavered from his belief that his predecessor was wrong to publicly clear from suspicion parents John and Patsy Ramsey, as well as brother Burke. I didn't feel the exoneration was warranted based on the state of the evidence and the complexity of the case. And I also thought it was a very unusual thing to do in a case where there had never been any charges filed. John, Burke, and the Ramsey family are totally covered by the presumption of innocence and are entitled to that, Boulder, Colorado District Attorney Stan Garnett tells people. If we ever change our opinion about that with regard to the Ramseys or anyone else, we will file charges and say what we have to say about the case in open court. But to issue an exoneration is, I think, misleading. When any district attorney goes around and starts issuing exonerations based on a particular piece of evidence, that can be very misleading to the public about the nature of the case. Recalling the infamously compromised crime scene that has created a challenge for all subsequent investigators, Garnett said, "The state of evidence is not one where you could really say anything definitively." Throughout this case, countless suspects were named, many linked directly to the Ramseys, but others were total strangers. I personally find that this crime bears all indications that it was committed by someone who knew the Ramsey home well, had access, and even knew where to find all the items that were used for the ransom note and the murder weapon. And it is my belief that they had a personal issue with JonBenet in some regard that led to them being very violent with her. Therefore, the only people who would adequately fit all of these categories for me would be the Ramseys themselves, meaning Patsy, John, or Burke, or if it was someone outside of this trio, I could only plausibly see it being an extended family member like John Andrew Ramsey, who may or may not have been seen at the house that day and had a semen-stained blanket in the nearby suitcase at the crime scene, or I could even plausibly see it having been one of the children's caretakers, like the housekeeper. Other than that, in my opinion, no one would have been able to account for all aspects of this case, which point to the fact that a person familiar with the home's difficult layout and the items within it committed this crime. Even in the ransom letter, the author fabricated the concept of a small foreign faction being responsible for the kidnapping to make the idea of an intruder less implausible by implying they were professionals and highly skilled, which would explain how they all got in without forced entry and knew the layout of the house. Yet the letter itself also betrayed the true depth of their criminal ineptitude, as did the fact that the garrote was so poorly constructed it couldn't really reasonably be considered a garrote. And oh yeah, for such professional kidnappers, the body was never taken. She was tortured and killed on site with supplies from the home. The fact that there were registered sex offenders in the neighborhood is a big sticking point for proponents of the intruder theory, and in fact, when I talked about wanting to discuss this case months ago, I received a comment from someone saying just that. They said definitively that this crime was committed by a pedo who lived nearby and that I was essentially wasting my breath suggesting otherwise. Obviously, I don't agree with them, which is why I would not spend any time entertaining the intruder theory or the suspects who falsely confessed to the crime for attention and were obsessed with JonBenet, because none of them left DNA at the scene. None of them took her from the home, which is what I believe a pedo intruder would have done. I believe an intruder would have been organized, especially coming into the home while the family was present, including the patriarch, who was ex-military and a well-known CEO whose company had recently been celebrated in the media for crossing $1 billion valuation. An intruder, or a foreign faction of the caliber the ransom note would like us to believe they were, would have come prepared with the ransom note already composed and not handwritten so that the author couldn't later be identified identified by their handwriting. We also know the note took at least 20 minutes to write when it was being copied by experts, so extemporaneously it would have taken much longer. No criminal would have risked remaining in the home that long because of an increased probability of being discovered. They also would have brought their own supplies and far better binding materials. They would not have sourced supplies critical for the success of their operation from within the home, including for the murder weapon itself, which they took time to construct while they were there. They also would not have used a loud taser to subdue the child, which more likely would have led to her screaming and crying and flailing to get away, and therefore would have left signs of a struggle in her bedroom. I also don't believe an intruder would have been able to navigate the labyrinthine home in the dark, which is a fact corroborated by law enforcement and the Ramseys themselves and their close relatives. And for that same reason, I do not believe an intruder would have taken her into the basement and risked getting lost or stuck down there. There was no reason for them to have their way with her in the home with the family present. They would have stolen her away in the night, never to be seen or heard from again, and if they were truly a child murdering pedo, they would not have used the basement for their exit. It's simply nonsensical on every level. They could have simply left out of any door or window on the first floor once they were inside, instead of struggling to squeeze her body into a suitcase, as was suggested, something else sourced from within the home that they did not bring and did not know would be readily available to them, and they would not have wanted to lift her dead weight inside of a large suitcase through a tight basement window and out of a narrow grate. And had they done so, there's no way any cobwebs or dust around the window grate would have remained undisturbed. We also know for a fact that John admitted to breaking the window himself previously when he was locked out of the home one day. And we also know that Fleet White admitted to moving the suitcase, so when the crime scene photos were taken showing the suitcase directly beneath the window, as though someone had used it as a step stool to get out of the window, something the intruder theory advocates always posit, we know by that time it was not in its original place, as it was when the crime actually took place. As with many other things in the home, some of the crime scene photos were capturing a lot of aspects of the home after things had been moved or changed, which is another troubling aspect of this botched crime scene. The intruder theory is also debunked by the mysterious bowl of pineapple with Burke and Patsy's fingerprints, which no one will cop to, which makes it even more suspicious, and is corroborated by the undigested pineapple in JonBenet's stomach that even Detective Lou Smit admitted was a major problem for his intruder theory. And what I keep saying is that Patsy possibly being awake all night also debunks this intruder theory. Also, simply put, crime statistics have proven that if a child of this age is killed, they are overwhelmingly more likely to have been killed by a family member than a stranger, something like 80 to 90%. It is exceedingly rare for a child to be killed by a perfect stranger, and this alone blows a hole through the intruder theory. And when you factor in the other evidence in this case, like the child being killed in the home with no signs of forced entry, the supplies for the murder weapon and ransom note being sourced from within the home, the ransom note being clearly staged and a total hoax since the child was discovered inside the home and was not kidnapped, Patsy wearing the same clothes the following morning that she had been wearing the previous evening, the bowl of pineapple found with Burke and Patsy's fingerprints, John oddly running directly to her body and seemingly pretending to have discovered it for the first time in front of Fleet, as well as the fact that her family were evasive and did not cooperate with the police in their efforts to solve her murder, to the point that even their best friends distanced themselves from the Ramseys, such as the Whites, and publicly called them out for not cooperating with the police. When taking all of that into consideration and the crime statistics for murders of a child this small, the probability of her having been killed by a stranger becomes vanishingly small. With a case that's been talked about for this long by millions across the world, from concerned consumers of media to former law enforcement officers, from dedicated online sleuths to meticulous authors and bold documentarians, it certainly makes you wonder what else there even is to add to the conversation. But still, I couldn't resist researching and formulating my own opinion of what I believe happened December 25th, 1996. And to be clear, it is pure speculation speculation and theory that will take place in this video, coupled with my own opinions, which are as informed as they can be as far as the publicly available evidence is concerned. What I'm going to attempt to do is apply the concept of keep it simple, stupid, it's not that complicated, or as some people call it, Occam's razor. There really is a straightforward, glaringly obvious answer to what took place that night. An answer I believe some people, including some experts and law enforcement officers who are very well read on this case, tend to miss because they overcomplicate their theories by trying to account for every nuance of the crime scene, when in reality, you just have to go with the most probable thing, even statistically speaking, and then narrow it down from there. Statistically speaking, a crime in which a child is harmed in the home is overwhelmingly more likely to have been committed by a member of the family or someone they know. That's just the facts, especially when there's no evidence of forced entry. The intruder theory was introduced by people who seemed to have a vested interest in absolving the Ramseys of any wrongdoing, when even a grand jury was able to conclude that, at the very least, the Ramseys were responsible for the circumstances that resulted in this child being harmed so brutally right under their noses. And that means something, that they were indicted by a grand jury. So it says something about how believable and sympathetic the Ramseys came off even back then. Not at all. And how can they not be responsible on any level? How can anyone possibly believe they were totally innocent, regardless of what your theory is on the case? They were still culpable with what happened to her, in my opinion. I'm sorry, but letting a small child sleep on a separate floor from you in a house that large, 7,000 square feet, is a huge no for me. Do you have any idea how big a 7,000 square foot house is, on top of them being on separate floors? Then also, admittedly, not bothering to set the alarm for the house and not having done so for months. They admitted this. John Ramsey admitted not setting the alarm on the house for months. That's another huge no for me. And I don't give a damn how safe you believe your neighborhood to be. Also, the fact that John admitted to kicking a window out in his own home so he could gain entry and not thinking to get it fixed immediately because someone else could gain entry the same way, that's idiotic. Also, if it were the case that a pedophilic intruder broke in and killed JonBenet, it would have been in no small part inspired by the highly inappropriate manner in which this child was slathered in adult-styled makeup and wearing adult-styled clothing and allowed to parade around provocatively, sometimes half-dressed. So in my opinion, and the opinion of the grand jury and many others, it is undeniable that John and Patsy Ramsey were responsible for their child's death, regardless of whether they had a direct hand in it or if an intruder came into the home and targeted her. But with the indications of chronic sexual abuse discovered by a panel of pediatric experts enlisted by the police department, that's not even the worst of what I feel they were responsible for enabling in that home. I know this is extremely controversial, but it's just my opinion, not based on any special facts that I have, just a workable theory based on the way I believe the evidence logically fits together in this case. To me, the simplest and most obvious explanation that no one has been able to effectively refute for me, despite all I've watched and all I've read, is that Burke Ramsey, her nearly 10-year-old brother, probably killed JonBenet. I don't personally believe it was on accident, insofar as I don't think it was an innocent hit on the head that led to her death. Her death could have been an accident. He possibly didn't know how much abuse would actually lead to her death, but I still believe the abuse that was inflicted on her was intentional and sadistic in nature. So I think that's kind of what's different about my theory than a lot of the other theories I've heard. Most people believe that whoever killed her by accident, whether it be John doing it in a weird dominatrix S&M sex fantasy, he accidentally killed her, or Patsy killing her out of rage because she wet the bed, or Burke killing her accidentally by hitting her on the head with something and the parents finished the job when they discovered her brain dead. I don't quite believe those theories. I believe the evidence amounts to someone torturing JonBenet and that it had been being done by the same person long before the night of her death. And I believe the night of her death, they took it too far. And I believe the parents covered the situation to protect him, of course, because that's also what the evidence reflects. And it hasn't been thoroughly refuted. And I believe this took place because he is possibly mentally ill. I believe Patsy initiated the cover-up because she was already awake, preparing for the plane trip the next day. That's like a perfectly motherly thing to do, to be up late, preparing for the trip, packing clothes, packing necessities, packing toiletries, because they had an early flight. So I do believe she was up and preparing for the trip, and that may have been what inspired the kids to be up and down when they were supposed to be in bed. They knew their mom was awake. Originally, we heard that Burke would not go to sleep because he was putting together a model. I believe it was a train model. I believe that is the partial truth. I believe he was putting together a train model. They may have told him to go to bed. He may have gone to bed for a second, and then he got up and went back at it. And I believe while he was up, he made him pineapple with milk and a cup of tea. And I believe at some time during the night, JonBenet either wet the bed and awakened and came downstairs and saw Burke and got into it with him, or he took her by the hand and led her to the basement to do what he possibly always does to her, or he gets her out of bed himself and takes her to do what he wants to do with her. And she might have wet herself while he was doing what he was doing to her and pissed him off. And that could have led to what happened. So anyway, I personally believe John Ramsey walked in on the chaos after being awakened by Patsy, and it was possibly at the last minute that John became involved. I truly believe he was told by Patsy that JonBenet had been taken. I think John slowly put the clues together himself, especially after he read the ransom note and possibly recognized her handwriting, and I believe he ultimately played along to protect his family. And I do not for a second believe he would have went along with this ruse to protect Patsy Ramsey. I do not believe that for a second. I believe he loved JonBenet enough to want to bring Patsy to justice, and vice versa. If John had done this, I think she loved JonBenet enough to bring him to justice, and also to probably knock his block off, like she said. I totally believed her when she said that statement. I believe the only incentive either parent would have had for covering the situation up is because Burke had done it. I do not believe for a second either of them would have covered up JonBenet's death if they knew the other parent was responsible for it. But Burke being responsible gave both parents incentive to be involved in the cover-up. And I think John instantly knew that Burke had done it when he realized what was going on. And he probably knew Burke had been doing things to her all along. And it had probably been an issue in the family because there were signs of chronic abuse. She went to the doctor excessively. She even went to the school nurse when she would go to school after being home. And it's also possible both parents agreed to cover up what happened to JonBenet because theoretically, they were aware she was being abused and exploited in that home all along, or had an inkling, and they feared this fact would also come out and incriminate them if they told the truth about what had been done. Again, I don't believe Burke theoretically harming JonBenet would have been a one-time accident. The evidence points to chronic abuse, but in my opinion, not at the hands of an adult. I believe he had possibly been chronically abusing her, both physically and at times sexually, meaning penetrating her with objects because he was just too young and inexperienced to rape her. But I believe the aggression was there. I believe the sadistic intent was there. And I believe he was sexually aroused by her due to her parents dressing her up and parading her around in public and in adult clothes and makeup. So basically the exact motives people are trying to put on an intruder coming into the home, it's possible someone in the home had those same motivations. And I do not believe John or Patsy Ramsey seemed inclined in that regard. But there are different aspects of Burke's personality that I will point out later that trouble me and that I believe could possibly result in him abusing her. This would also account for the chronic bedwetting, like Detective Steve Thomas said. In her little 6-year-old mind, this could have been the only conceivable form of defense for her. She probably pissed herself to make him stop, and this could have led to rage, an explosive moment where he hit her with an object and then choked her and ended her life. I also personally believe Burke crafted not a garrote, as some people call it, but what others have referred to as a Boy Scout's toggle. For me, this is the smoking gun. The image of a Boy Scout's toggle is a dead ringer for the image of the murder weapon that killed JonBenet. Some experts had mentioned this wasn't really a garrote, and I totally agree. Garrotes typically have handles at both ends lens, and some experts have described the ligature that killed JonBenét as a noose with a handle. They also said the word Garotte seemed to be used initially to imply that the instrument was sophisticated and that it would take someone with significant skill to construct, which is simply not true. You can see it was a crude instrument and does appear to be something a curious young boy would fashion on his own without help. The use of the paintbrush also, to me, points to the actions of a experimental, inquisitive young boy and not a criminal mastermind creating a crude murder weapon on the spot after having come into the house unprepared to commit the crime they clearly premeditated. Also, as law enforcement even pointed out, it would have been quite unnecessary for an adult to have fashioned a ligature to kill a child as small as JonBenét, when choking her with their hands would have worked just as well. This crime does not make sense when viewed through the lens of an adult intruder or even her adult parents harming her to cover up the crime. But the crime and the murder weapon used does make perfect sense when viewed through the lens of the actions of a sexually aggressive 10-year-old boy who had been chronically abusing and molesting his much younger 6-year-old sister all along. In my opinion, the ligature was fashioned by a boy who was confirmed by his parents to have been in the Boy Scouts, although some people argue that it would have been the Cub Scouts for his age range. And a lot of people dismiss that Burke could have even committed this horrible crime because he was only 9 years old and so innocent. They like to pretend he was similar in age and capability to JonBenét, but that is patently false. And regardless of what his age was, it in no way precludes his ability to be violent or sadistic or harm someone far weaker than him, nor does it preclude his ability to have been sexually inquisitive or physically aggressive with her that night or any other night. It's important to note, at the time of JonBenét's death, Burke was actually a month away from being 10 years old on January 27th. Remember, it was December 25th, so almost exactly a month away. He was born in 1987, so in essence, it was a 10-year-old male harming a 6-year-old girl whose 7th birthday was still over 8 months away in August. And apart from the debate about Burke's age and capabilities as far as the Boy Scouts was concerned, Burke also would have been familiar with knot tying through his experiences sailing, rock climbing, and the fact that his father was ex-military. Those are the sorts of things men teach their young boys: how to tie knots, how to do sports, how to be good at everything. And I'll speak a little further on why I think Burke did it after I explain why I personally feel John and Patsy Ramsey did not harm JonBenét that night. Again, this is all pure speculation and theory and opinion on my end. I know a lot of people tend to think Patsy or John did it, and I totally get why, because in this case, a lot doesn't make sense, so everyone has to remain a suspect until the killer is actually found, definitively. But I don't think some people understand what that really implicates when you say Patsy or John did this, because in my opinion, I don't believe the crime itself was staged. I believe the injuries JonBenét suffered were real and deliberately inflicted and were dealt by a sick, sadistic mind. And I believe only a mentally ill 9-year-old boy or 10-year-old boy would have been capable of doing this. Not a normal boy, but someone who was mentally ill. I do believe the parents staged the crime scene insofar as moving her body and knowing where she was all along and going along with the ransom note lie, but I do not believe they had a hand in physically violating JonBenét's body just to cover up what her brother may have done to her. I don't think John and Patsy were capable of even that, nor do I think they would have gone that far to protect Burke, basically violating her body, penetrating her with an object, or choking her out. I just don't see it. Harming your daughter while she is still semi-alive or violating her body while she is dying is extremely perverse, and I don't see especially Patsy being capable of that. And as far as John is concerned, just like he alluded to himself, if he had been involved in staging the crime scene, I believe he would have done a much better job than what had been done. I believe this was botched because it was done by a middle-aged, hysterical, former beauty pageant queen. That's just what makes logical sense. It's obvious John is deeply introspective, intelligent, and analytical, and his success in business and his history in the military speak to that. I totally agree that he would have done a far better job at staging the crime scene and diverting attention away to an actual intruder. He would have done what was necessary to make it appear as though an intruder came into the home. I also don't think he would have been okay with letting Patsy theoretically write that moronic, self-defeating ransom note. I personally believe he was brought in at the last possible second and may have even been still reading the ransom note while Patsy was dialing 911. And that call would have basically locked them into her insane cover-up before he could even figure out what was going on. Hearing JonBenet had been taken was probably instantly call the police. I don't care what's going on. Call the police. Get them here. And then he probably would have went to look for her and then read the note. My general argument for why I do not believe Patsy or John harmed JonBenet in any way that night, especially because I believe the evidence indicates the harm done to her was deliberate and sadistic and not in any way accidental, is because it takes a very particular type of personality and a particular type of psychological makeup to be able to harm a small child in a violent, sadistic manner. And remember, many experts agreed that the evidence showed indications that JonBenet had been chronically sexually abused. We cannot ignore that or dismiss it just because it doesn't fit into one theory or another that most people have adopted, that being the intruder theory even. The presence of those troubling indications, which pointed to her experiencing chronic abuse, demands that we view this crime through the lens of everything having been done to her that night deliberately and maliciously, and by someone with malintent, someone who wanted her to suffer and who had been making her suffer in many ways before her death that night. So if the argument is that Patsy or John killed this sweet little 6-year-old and that they were being sadistic and deliberate in doing so, then it is my personal belief that this isn't really supported by the evidence, nor is it supported by who they appear to be, both public-facing and in their private lives. And this is based on their personalities, their education, their accomplishments, and their social circles. These were highfalutin, wealthy, wildly successful people. John was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Patsy was also highly educated and accomplished in her own right. She graduated from the University of West Virginia with a master's degree in marketing, journalism, and communications, and had worked for multiple companies. So these well-adjusted, well-educated, successful, happily married socialites do not fit the bill for who we typically see harming children, statistically speaking. It takes a certain type of person, and there are typically glaring indicators that a person is even capable of doing something like this, meaning there is some sort of substance abuse or addiction, or there is some level of mental illness or psychosis, or there is a history of violence or disturbed behavior. There are people on the fringe of society with not so great social circles, or there are antisocial personality traits that indicate psychopathy or sociopathy, or there are sick proclivities or a history of domestic abuse in the home. All of these things were absent where Patsy and John were concerned, as far as I know. So again, it is highly unlikely that either of them killed JonBenet intentionally or sadistically, and I just believe the evidence doesn't suggest that she was killed accidentally. So when you factor in either of them committing this crime accidentally, for me it still falls into the category of highly unlikely. It's obvious that JonBenet was loved and adored by her parents, and probably too much because it went well into the realm of creepy, the way they propped her up like a little doll or a shining trophy. I feel Patsy deeply loved her, and that JonBenet was in a way a new lease on life for her as she aged and was unable to perform in pageants anymore. And of course, after she had become gravely ill, I feel like she poured her life into JonBenet and adored that girl, which inadvertently could have been what led to JonBenet's abuse and her death at the hands of someone who was deeply envious of that connection they had. So I believe the parents would not have handled her carelessly or would have directed explosive rage towards her on a whim which led to her death. From what I can see, they were careful with her physically in the way we're all careful with children, meaning holding their hand when they cross the street and making sure they're tucked in safely at night and fed and groomed. I don't see Patsy suddenly losing it and knocking this little girl over the head, or even later strangling her to cover up the blow to the head. I don't see signs that indicate Patsy was in any way physically violent or explosive or unpredictable or addicted to any substances that would have led to her having a momentary lapse in judgment. Although it's possible that this is just evidence that didn't surface. And also, it's important to note, sexual or violent sadism is far more rare in women than it is in men, and we cannot forget this crime seemed to have a sexual abuse component to it. I ultimately feel the same about John. It takes a ton of skill and intelligence and forethought to run a successful company and to be operating it at the highest level, meaning chief executive officer. The company lives or dies on your every word or action. You typically live a very intentional life in that case. And although psychopaths tend to rise to the top of companies and thrive there, it's important to remember that not all psychopaths are violent. And there are no indications from what I've seen that John Ramsey is a sadistic psychopath incapable of feeling empathy. Unlike Jose Menendez, the Menendez brothers' father, who was indeed a CEO, but clearly exhibited psychopathic and sadistic tendencies, both at home and among work colleagues who testified in court about his behavior. They attested to him being equally feared and hated everywhere he went. John Ramsey did not inspire that same resounding universal antipathy. To me, he often came off as not a psychopath, which is the best way I can put it. Yes, I know psychopaths have the inhuman ability to mask themselves and appear charming and to be sociable and mimic the emotions of the normies, but there's other evidence that supports the idea that John is not a psychopath, such as character witnesses. Don't get me wrong, he's obviously very disingenuous at times, and I certainly believe there is a great deal of dishonesty in the narrative he sells to the public regarding his account of events that night. And I believe he is still lying to the public to this very day. But in my opinion, that's obviously because he's been working for years to sustain an elaborate cover-up and lie. And he would only do that, especially after Patsy's death, if either he or Burke were responsible for what happened that night. Otherwise, he would have retired a long time ago. Regardless, I don't read anything particularly evil about him. I just don't. Plus, you have to take into account that he had been previously married and had multiple grown children. So I believe if there was abuse among those older children, it would have come out at some point, especially with the heavy scrutiny on the family since JonBenét's death. And it's unlikely that suddenly in his second marriage, he developed the proclivity to hurt children, either sexually or violently. And I also believe he comes off as too docile and reserved to think that behind the scenes, he was violent or explosive in a manner that could have led to her death on one random Christmas night. There would have been signs all along of him having explosive anger or explosive rage and being abusive. I just don't see it. I believe he loved and adored JonBenet and was careful with her. I honestly believe he did carry her up the stairs and tucked her in and believed that she was safe. He was just negligent in ensuring that she was safe. And again, I also believe John may have been the last person to learn what happened to JonBenet when he woke that day, because there are just too many times in the descriptions of him in different police reports and Steve Thomas's book, and even later in interviews, where he truly comes off as clueless and just trying to put things together as best he can while protecting his family. However, Patsy has always, without fail, read as disingenuous to me. Her body language, her attitude, the cadence with which she speaks and strings words together, there is something always off in her delivery. It doesn't quite reach the level of authenticity or being genuine. Like when she said that line about keep your babies close, there's someone out there. Everyone could read that there was something off about her delivery of that line. And what we're reading is dishonesty. To my point about John being clueless about what was going on, there is a point at the end of the 911 call where their voices were enhanced and it is believed to be the voice of John who says, "We are not talking to you." And it's believed this was directed at the childlike voice present, who later questioned, "What did you find?" To me, this fits in with what I strongly believe took place. Burke possibly hurt JonBenét and had probably been doing things all along, and that the parents were aware and dealing with this issue, and that it went too far that night, and that Patsy helped cover for Burke and brought John in on the situation late, and John was slowly figuring out what was going on as the morning unfolded, but he had an inkling that his son was responsible for whatever happened. And I believe Burke was asking, "What did you find?" because he was awake and involved in the situation. Likely, he knew John swept the house upon being told JonBenét was missing and couldn't find anything. And in the 911 calls in audio, theoretically, Burke was asking John what had he found during that search, trying to gauge how much he knew at that point about his and Patsy's theoretical cover-up. Because why else would a 9-year-old boy be involved in this conversation to that extent if he wasn't heavily involved in the search party in some way? Which blows a hole in the Ramseys' assertion that he was innocently asleep upstairs the entire time. In my opinion, there is something severely wrong with Burke, and it's apparent in the only interview he gave as an adult with Dr. Phil. To me personally, as someone who also suffers from social anxiety and have my entire life, whatever appears to be wrong with Burke extends far outside the realm of social anxiety or social awkwardness and its typical hallmarks. I totally get how those two things would impact his ability to come off as honest or sympathetic because he's awkward. I totally get that, and I'm not holding the social awkwardness against him, but there is something more there that is wrong beyond extreme shyness, and it's apparent in his interviews as a child when he was alone in a room with a detective and a doctor, not recording a TV interview with a film crew present that would air to millions. His behavior in those interviews are actually the true giveaway, in my opinion. There is something that feels deceptive about him, or more specifically, something that feels disingenuous about his account of events. When I watched Burke's videos as a 9-year-old who was 1 month away from being 10 years old, they were so chilling and off-putting to me. And I got this feeling the second I saw him on camera. And I even got this feeling in a documentary that was meant to be sympathetic towards him and his parents, the Netflix doc. I'm really good at reading people and body language and their affect. So when something is off, I can almost always sense it. I call it discernment. I can't explain exactly what it is. It's just something that has always been the case for me. I'm a really good judge of character and usually spot red flags where other people don't. From the second I saw Burke on camera in the police interview, something in my mind instantly went, "It was him. Oh my gosh, it's so obvious it was him." Again, this is totally my personal opinion. I have zero facts to prove he did anything. I'm just stating my strong intuitions here. But in my mind, the second I saw him in the Netflix doc, I went, yup. Case closed. There is no more discussion to be had. He is seriously mentally disturbed, and I could tell that by watching him for all of 30 seconds in a muted interview. Most glaringly, what stood out to me is that he is not sad that his sister is dead. Quite shortly after her death, he is not in the tiniest, infinitesimally small bit phased that his sister is dead. Forget crying. He is not even remotely disturbed. You mean to tell me someone's gonna come in my house, murder my little sister in the basement, and I'm not gonna be visibly distraught or even shaken or worried that I'm next? Social anxiety be damned. He is not in any perceivable way fearful, let alone heartbroken, mentally anguished, or at the very least in mourning. And by the way, his lack of fear is a far greater commentary on the truth of the matter than his being devoid of emotion when speaking about his dead sister, especially in the interview that occurred not long after her murder. It matters because a lack of fear for his own well-being decidedly speaks to the fact that, again, he and his parents did not perceive a true threat, just like they had allowed him to be alone upstairs on a separate floor while JonBenét was theoretically kidnapped by a foreign faction. At that time, they showed little concern for him being out of sight and out of mind, which normally normal parents would not have done if there was an inherent threat from a foreign faction. This all plays at the level of the subconscious though, and it is typically not something you even think of when, let's say, you're staging a kidnapping and performing in front of law enforcement. And likewise, Burke's lack of fear when being interviewed shortly after her murder is strange, and even the doctor who interviewed him spoke to this fact. Quote, "The boy remembered his sister being nice, but added, sometimes she bugged me." Bernhardt asked how he was dealing with his sister's death, and Burke replied, "I kind of forget about it. I just kind of go," and he lapsed into sounds similar to Nintendo beeps. "What do you think happened to your sister?" "I know what happened to my sister. She was killed." "But what happened?" "I know what happened." "How was she killed? Have you talked to your parents about it?" "I asked my dad, where did you find her body?" He said, "In the basement. I think someone took her down in the basement, took a knife out." Losing his words, he made a slashing gesture, or hit her on the head. His descriptions were flat and indifferent. Bernhardt detected no fear that the killer might come back for him, or that Burke thought his family was in danger. The psychologist said it was very unusual for a child to feel safe when a sibling had been violently killed. And there it is. It's the exact thing that struck me when I first saw him in the clip. Not any social awkwardness or the fact that he wasn't crying, but an appalling lack of feeling, period. Total indifference to the extremely difficult subject matter he was discussing, that being the violent murder of his baby sister, and even referring to her body. Where did you find her body? That's not something a normal 10-year-old would say. He did not exhibit apprehension in the least, let alone sorrow. In this clip, he is not feeble, he is not uneasy, he is not tentative, he is not withdrawn, he is present, he is cold. And in this clip, about a year later, when he was 11 years old, he is emotionless, undaunted, casual, relaxed, and at times even smiling. He almost comes off as smarmy. And again, in that first interview, this is not a 4 or 5-year-old whose behavior you can almost excuse because their youth would affect their ability to communicate effectively. This is a boy who is basically 10 years old, plenty old enough to sit down straight in a chair and behave during this interview. Yet, when speaking to the psychologist, he is all over the place and fidgeting and putting the game over his head like a 5-year-old. There's a dissonance there that I can't quite explain because I'm not a psychologist, but suffice it to say, in my opinion, there is something wrong with him. And that something wrong, I believe, led him to play with his own shit as a child, including reportedly smearing it on the walls. It also led to him hitting JonBenet in the face with a golf club, and that something wrong is what theoretically could have driven him to harm JonBenet that night, and his parents were possibly covering for him. Burke theoretically had motive, means, and opportunity. Motive would have theoretically been the older sibling being outshined by not only an adorable younger sibling, but also a starlit pageant princess who was her parents' shining glory and who stole the attention of any room she walked into. That typical sibling rivalry could have been taken to a whole different level in this case if Burke is mentally ill in some way. And it is my belief that Burke could have felt intimidated by JonBenet's existence and the fact that she had stolen his parents' affection for good. He had means because theoretically all of the items used to harm JonBenet were sourced from within the house, especially the ligature, which was a crude instrument that could have been fashioned by a 10-year-old boy who had been in the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts and whose father had been in the Navy and likely taught him how to make interesting knots and who had experience with camping, rock climbing, boating, and other sports. The opportunity is there, especially for Burke, in my opinion, since his fingerprints were found all over the bowl of pineapple that was left behind in the kitchen, and the cup of tea, which places him awake and out of bed after his parents believed him to be asleep, since neither of them said they had served him the pineapple, and they were unaware of him eating it. And we know it wasn't a bowl of pineapple that had been rotting on the counter for days because JonBenet had eaten some and it was found undigested in her intestines. So that means it was likely prepared after they returned home from the Whites party and her food she had consumed there was already digested. And this places both JonBenet and Burke awake late into the night when their parents believed them to be asleep. And Burke's behavior when directly asked about the pineapple is so highly suspicious. and his reaction was odd enough for me to deduce that the pineapple might have played a major role in whatever happened that night. For normal people, we're incapable of hurting others because we have the ability to feel empathy, so it leads us to not harm others because we know what it would feel like to experience that harm. But with a person whose ability to feel empathy is incapacitated or entirely missing, then that is no longer a hindrance to them harming others, whether for personal gain, vengeance, to neutralize a perceived threat, sadism, or any other number of reasons, and especially for sexual gratification, which is what we see a lot with violent killers, particularly serial killers. There is a sexual component to what they're doing. They are not affected by other people's emotions, so they are invulnerable to seeing someone cry in terror or scream in agony, which makes them all the more capable of doing whatever they need to achieve their ends. They also are not plagued by a pesky conscience, which makes them feel guilty after the heinous deed is done. And of course, for sadists in particular, they actually take pleasure in the part where they harm another person. And this is what motivates them to do it in the first place. They get off on their victims' fear, pain, and humiliation, and even look back on the experience with a perverse sense of gratification. In Burke's interview with the doctor, there is a bone-chilling moment where he describes what he believes happened to JonBenet, and it sounds like he's just telling everyone precisely what he did. He literally said, "Someone took her quietly into the basement," and then he makes the motion of striking her in the head, and I believe he even utters the word "whoops" while doing it, indicating whoever hit her might not have meant to hit her so hard. It may have been a sarcastic whoops, like whoops, and he knew exactly what he was doing. So, if Burke was possibly incapable of feeling empathy, theoretically, then that makes lying easier because you're not predisposed to the anxiety and guilt one would feel if they were capable of feeling empathy and therefore would have compunction about lying, meaning your heart rate goes up and you sweat, you have anxiety when you're aware you're not telling the truth and you're worried that other people can see this. That is what is detected during a polygraph or a lie detector test, but people who have antisocial personality disorders are unfazed by all of that. Most of those anxieties don't factor into how they perceive the world or how they perceive other people. They just don't care. So they will be more than capable of lying with ease. And that is the end of my theory. It's just my opinion. I guess we'll never know what truly happened to JonBenet. I hope either John or Burke comes clean about what they know someday. Maybe John will do it on his deathbed because he's pretty old now. Hopefully he won't take it to the grave like Patsy did. I just hope one day JonBenet gets justice because she certainly deserves it.